My name is Meredith Leigh. I work here at Living Web Farms. I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator. I'm also seem to be involved in all the cooking projects that happen and fermentation and teaching cooking classes. And I co-manage the livestock. And this is Pat. He's the director here. And if you're not familiar with Living Web Farms, we're an education and research farm that's focused on building systems for resiliency and sustainability. So tonight, we've been doing a series of classes called Essentials of Cooking, kind of trying to outline the basic building blocks of good food. And so this is actually the fourth in that series of classes. And if you missed the other ones, you can catch them online. The other ones around salt and fat, and then fire or heat. And so today's class is all about acid, which might be my favorite one of all of those. And it was funny, we were making lots of jokes about what we were teaching tonight. Like, what are you doing? I'm teaching class, what are you doing? Cooking. Cooking what? Acid? I don't know. So what is an acid? What are we talking about when we're talking about that? Well, we're talking about any ingredient that you can incorporate into a recipe that has a pH below 7. And so what the heck does that mean? A lot of people who are gardeners or are scientists in other ways are familiar with pH, but it stands for potential of hydrogen. And so it speaks to, and it's a way of measuring, loose hydrogen ions in solution. Okay, so water, let's take water as a starting point. Water is made up of H2Os, right? A bunch of little H2Os together. And even in water, which is relatively stable, it's got a pH around 7, which is considered neutral. There will be a few hydrogen ions that bump off and dissociate from those bonds, and then they're just like freely moving around in solution. And so solutions of any kind that have the tendency to release positively charged hydrogen ions, the higher their tendency to do that, the more acidic they are, all right? And so that's why that pH goes down on the scale. So the scale measures from 1 to 14, 7 being in the middle neutral. So from 1 to 7, the lower numbers are more acidic. And from 8 to 14, the higher numbers are considered more alkaline. Solutions that tend to acquire positively charged ions and incorporate them into their bonds are considered the more basic solutions, right? But we're not necessarily talking about those tonight. We are talking about balancing them. And so we could give you can look up in lots of different cookbooks the relative pH of a lot of different things in your kitchen, but we're talking about a whole host of potential ingredients that are probably in your pantry now that you may not be using in the broadest way that you could. And so tonight's class is about enhancing flavor and sensory experience, and also balancing flavor, and maybe even doing a little chemistry using just the acids that you find in your kitchen cabinet. So we're talking about lemons, limes, other citrus, wine is considered an acid. Any cultured dairy product like buttermilk, yogurt, whey, that if you strain your yogurt and get the whey off, that's a great acid you can use. Creme fraiche, which is like sour cream, but better. A lot of cheeses, fermented cheeses, raw tomatoes, fermented vegetables and their brines, vinegars, cocoa that is non-alkalized, brown sugar, honey, caramel, raw milk, fresh milk, and all kinds of fresh fruits. So that might sound surprising that all of those things are actually considered acids. And of course, all those things are different acidities relative to one another, right? So a lemon is much more acid than fresh milk, right? A raw tomato is going to be much more acid than a peach, right? But the key is the way those ingredients balance the acids that they contain with other components. So fresh fruits have a ton of acids in them. And if you think about it, it's obvious, like oxalic acid, citric acid. You hear about ascorbic acid or vitamin C. These are things that are inherently in our foods. But the balance of those to the sugars in the fruit is what makes that fruit more sour or more sweet. And I actually read today that on one citrus tree, the oranges might be more sweet the closer they are to the ground as opposed to higher in the tree, and depending on the time of year and the amount of light they're getting. So it's pretty fascinating. But we're not going to confuse you that much tonight. So those are kind of the top players. If we think of any more that I didn't mention, feel free to holler out.
Yeah, soy sauce and miso. The salt kind of overwhelms them, but they are quite acid.
They are quite acid, and they're more likely to be categorized as umami ingredients, right? So that's like that sixth taste bud of like fullness. It really translates into deliciousness in our language. But it is, and it's very often like there's a blurry line between umami and acid, right? Because cheeses are considered umami, salamis and fermented foods are considered umami, but they're also considered acid. So we'll talk about both of those, but I think if you're using umami ingredients like soy sauce, you're not getting as bright of a flavor, you're getting more of a deep umami flavor, so you'll still need acid notes, right, in order to really balance the dish, right? So why are acids useful in cooking? Why does this all matter? Well, you have a special taste bud just for sourness, right? And so when we look like what makes food good, what makes good food universally is it enlightens all of your senses, right? It activates all of your taste buds. So we have to have all those flavor notes, and acid or sourness is one of them. And so we're not necessarily looking to like pucker up, because of our cooking, but we want enough acid in there to balance particularly bitterness and sweetness that's inherent in food. Also, acid notes in food are what actually make them mouthwatering and what make us salivate. So it stimulates salivation. Mouthwatering is associated with really good food anyway. So that's another little tidbit about why we need acid so much. Contrast is another big reason that we use acid. And so this is a perfect time for us to do this little activity. We have inherently bitter greens and then several ways of adding an acid kick to them. Do you want to explain what they're about to eat?
Yeah, okay, so you're going to eat a mix of dandelion greens, pretty darn bitter, right? Creasy greens, quite bitter, especially if you don't luck out and find the lighter green version. The darker green version is quite bitter, and fortunately, since I wanted this to be bitter, I didn't worry about it, and I didn't bump into a single light green one. So it's good and bitter, okay? And then add it to that to bulk it up and to cut it a little bit so I didn't totally shut you down before you even started tasting, a fair amount of kale, which some people think is bitter. I never think of kale as bitter unless it's been mistreated, or it's way too hot out. But I'm actually a big fan of that taste bud, bitter. I think bitter is really underrated and not used enough in this country. It's really heavily used in Asia, and other cultures appreciate it more too. And you'll get to play with it today, and the idea being, also, I didn't salt the grains because I didn't want to distract you, but you can add salt if you think that helps you to taste it, and just pass the salt shaker.
It will help you to taste it.
Yes, it will help you to taste it, it's true.
Salt it.
You should salt it, but if we have so little, they might want to first see what it tastes like without, and then add a touch of salt. Anybody needs more salt, which I probably would. I use
So
salt.
if you don't take anything away from this class other than right before you eat food, put a twist of acid on it, that is fine with me, right? Most people get an idea in their head, spend a lot of time cooking, or spend a lot of time gathering the components of a favorite recipe from a chef or a friend. But usually in the absence of a written recipe, that resulting food will fall short of what they wanted it to be because acid is missing, right? If you ask somebody, oh, what'd you put on there? They're like, oh, it's just greens. It's just greens, But they may be like, oh, it's just greens with just a tiny twist of lemon. And that could be like the key element, all right? So if you're ever just like eating something that you created and you're worried that it's just like not quite complete, I guarantee you a little bit of acid will bring it to the next level. And so this is just the simplest thing that you can do at the table, and a few different options for what you could do to make it sharper and make it brighter.
If you will keep doing this, I'll get the forks. Also, years ago, I taught a cooking class, cooking from as many things as we can find in the winter in North Carolina. We had over 100 and some food items that we were able to find that were produced locally in the winter. And it was soups were one of the main things we did. And people made soups, and I didn't really give them a lot of tricks up ahead to make those soups really come forward and taste. Then they took smaller amounts of them and added various things. And one of the things they added that really brought that flavor out was just a squeeze of lemon or a dash of vinegar.
Great. So contrast, and we'll give you a few minutes to work with that.
And maybe I'll describe
Yeah, go ahead.
how the mock cranberry sauce is made. Need another plate. Mock cranberry sauce is made with a plant called roselle, which is in the okra family. And it has a flower that looks just like an okra flower, but then after the flower has bloomed, it already has a waxy red calyx that's on the back of it, and then it gets covered by a waxy red seed pod cover. And this is what, if you've ever had red zinger tea, this is what gives red zinger that zing and that redness, okay? And it's known in Mexico as the flower of Jamaica. And you can even see in some angles, they'll sometimes be selling that. Those things say flower of Jamaica.
You put nothing in these greens? Zero.
Well, a little bit of olive oil to cook them in. That's it. I think they're good the way they are too. See, now you've got a taste for bitter though, right? Yeah, right. Yeah. But then see what happens with the different things you add to them.
So what are these other things on the plate?
Okay, so you have yuzu, which is that tiny piece of citrus, because I didn't bring two down.
The citrus with the bigger seeds, that's more likely in a quarter size wedge, is the yuzu.
So it's a little laborious. You have to peel that seed cover and waxy calyx off, and it's best if done fresh, and this was fresh. But you can also buy the dried stuff and just rehydrate it. And so you take that and you put it in a pot and add just a teeny bit of water so it won't burn as it starts to cook, and then sweats the water out of the seed pod and calyx. And as it starts to cook, you add honey to taste. And you might taste what I made. You can see I didn't add a lot of honey. I wanted to go for more of the sour. But if you don't add any, it'll be way too strong. And that's all there is to it. Then you cook it until the structure of that calyx and seed pod cover has dissolved. And it's done. It's about one of the easiest things in the world to make.
The recipe's in your handout. And
it's basically a great local way to make cranberry sauce. Since growing cranberries isn't as easy here, you can grow roselle quite easily. It's a perennial in the Caribbean and in Asia where it's warm enough, but here it's an annual.
It's not hibiscus you're talking about.
Well, they call it hibiscus on the tea package because they didn't want to confuse people and people didn't know what it was. But that's a very big family, so there's a lot of ornamental hibiscus. It's not that. The name, if you're buying it in a catalog and to keep from confusing people, that's better as roselle. But then you might say, you may know it as hibiscus if you drink red zinger tea.
They say Jamaica. It's in Jamaica, Jamaica in Spanish.
Yeah, and they sell it fleur de Jamaica in Ingalls. Did you say that?
Yeah, and some Ingalls.
And our first Make It White Wilshire pack, you made that on the video.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's how to make it. You can watch me making it. I don't know that you need to, though. It's pretty easy to make. Yeah, right, yeah. So are you seeing the differences the different sours have on that bitter effect?
Any thoughts? What's your favorite?
It's all good.
This is new to me, the yuzu.
Yuzu is really,
really,
that's really.
Oh, yuzu is endless in its possibilities. And a lot of times just the rind is zested, which you might have said, like the zest is used.
It's very tender rind.
Yeah, it is, yeah. You can use the heck out of it. Sometimes I just chop the whole thing up. I don't even worry about it. It just disappears. And indeed, I just was curious, so I went to the various online marketers, and you can buy yuzu marmalade.
Oh, yeah.
Which would be,
What do they look like? Put it in your tea.
They're,
just looks like a lemon, but it's rounder and
squatter.
smaller.
It's a squatter lemon.
It's like a kumquat.
Well, it may remind you of a kumquat. It is a cross between a mandarin orange and a lime. And indeed,
New hybrid?
not in Japan, I don't think. No, I think they've been doing it. It's a major part of their culture. It's a big deal. They bathe in the juice.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's good for. And indeed, you can buy yuzu oil for making you look young for the rest of your life or whatever.
Awesome.
So, that comes from the seed. Pardon?
Where did you get them?
I grew them, and they're very easy to grow. And maybe next year I will do that as make it, don't buy it. I'll show people how to. I'll give you branches you can start and teach you how to do it. And by the next year, you can give somebody a baby yuzu tree. And then in about 7 years, they'll have yuzu. But that's a good gift because they get to watch it grow and really connect to it, right? Okay, any other comments? Anything else yeah?
They just did have an article on, I think it was Natural News, that the nutrient density is so much higher in the wild foods than it is.
Oh, yeah, that is so true. Yeah, completely, yeah. Did any of the other sours have an impressive impact on the greens for you? Any favorites besides the yuzu? The chutney, yeah. Uh-huh.
Actually, the balsamic.
Mm-hmm. It's a classic. It's totally a classic, yeah.
You have to be, it does overpower.
You got to be careful with that, yeah. Okay.
But they're all distinctly different tastes.
They all are going to affect it differently, and it's a great way to start to acquaint yourself with the different flavors. And that's a good way to teach yourself how to cook, by the way, is like, okay, there are all these acids, let's get them all lined up and make something that's not overwhelming, or in this case is overwhelming, and see what the impact is.
But also just match it also to like the cuisine that you're trying to make, right? So if you're making Japanese food, the yuzu is a great option, or a black vinegar would be a great option, but balsamic wouldn't be so. I mean, you could do it, but if you're like lost, then just go to the origin of the food itself, right? And because there are very classic vinegars used in different regions around the world. Anyways, right, whatever they had and what they developed. So we got the contrast, we got the balance.
And one last point, if you tried and you still have any greens left, try the champagne vinegar because that won't be nearly as overwhelming. Or just know that. It's a very light, not as intense a vinegar.
So the other thing I want to talk, because I always like to talk about the food sciencey stuff, but acids are super important in chemical reactions in food, which people don't often think of. One thing they do is, this doesn't sound very good, but toughening. We don't like to think about toughening our food, but consider that if you're cooking for something for a really long time, it can get mushy, right? But acids help, particularly things with hemicellulose or cellulose in their makeup, so like beans and vegetables. If you're cooking them for a really long period of time, incorporating acid in that cooking solution is going to help those things hold up during a long cooking time. So this is particularly true of beans. So that's a positive thing. The other thing is if acid is added too early, right, then it can take longer for those beans to cook, right? So you have to use it in moderation or at the right time. The other thing is acids are involved in, this also sounds bad, stiffening, but when you think about it in context, it works because think about making an egg foam or a meringue. You always add cream of tartar, right? Why do you do that? Well, cream of tartar is tartaric acid. It's a byproduct of the wine industry. And what happens is those loose hydrogen ions that are flummoxing around are then available for bonding with the sulfur in the egg whites, right? And then that creates a more stable structure, which is why your egg whites will hold up better in meringue if there's an acid added. You don't have to add cream of tartar. You can just add lemon juice, right? It's just the acid component with the free hydrogens that help that medium stiffen. And so the same thing is true of like setting jams and jellies. It's the acids that bond to pectin that's why we often, if you're doing a really old-fashioned marmalade, you'll actually like boil lemon seeds to help your, and then use that solution to help your jam set because the acids are actually part of that stabilization process. The other thing is working on proteins. And I know that you have some comments about this. Like acids, they affect the way proteins like gluten and collagen will denature and then coagulate. So did you have a spot on bread that you wanted to say?
Well, actually, there's two ways that, and I don't really want to go into the chemistry of the second way because it's kind of esoteric. You have to be into making 100% rye bread for it to matter. But in all bread making, acid actually can help to strengthen the gluten. And so that can be major if you're using less flours that have less gluten. It can also make it easier for you if you're not so good at kneading because it'll help to strengthen it that way. And it can go to a point where it actually inhibits another process in bread making. And that's called autolyzing. And that's where you just mix up the water and the liquid ingredients that aren't fermentative, and you mix those in and let it sit, and the gluten will actually develop by sitting there. Just from being moistened, it'll develop. And if you give it just a quick stir every 5 minutes or so, within 15 minutes, a whole lot of your gluten development will have occurred. However, if you use sourdough starter, that'll slow it down because it's going to tighten the gluten up. So sourdough starter is great for helping to strengthen the structure of your bread, but it's not great at that stage. You don't want the acids in at that stage. The other way that acid works in bread that's very useful is it works as a preservative. We didn't really talk about that a whole lot, but you can just classic. I don't worry about it anymore. But back in the 80s when I was making bread and living in a yurt with no air conditioning, I could have bread mold in 2 days. And just learning to put like a teaspoon of vinegar in that bread could make it last for more like 3 to 5.
So at what stage would you add the vinegar then?
The vinegar can go in probably not the sponge because it would be inhibiting once again that way, right?
But after you've salted it and you're like kneading.
As you're kneading it, yeah. You wouldn't have to wait even after you salt. Just in the final ingredients when you're kneading, you just add the vinegar. and it'll work as a great preservative, you know?
Kind of delicate like that. Like, with meat, for example, because the acids affect the way the proteins actually like denature and then coagulate again. So you can put a piece of meat in buttermilk or something, and it tenderizes it right away, because those proteins denature. But if you leave it in there too long, they'll actually coagulate and they'll toughen up again. So you can't leave it in an acid brine too long. And of course, the length of time depends on the cut, like the size of the cut, right? So that's why if you have like a pork chop or a piece of fish and you dredge it in buttermilk and then you bread it and then you fry it, the buttermilk has an extremely tenderizing effect, right? And a nice pop of flavor. But if you were to let something very thin and small sit in acid, a lot of like old timers will actually like put their meat in pickle juice as like a brine and then we'll cook it. But if it sits too long, then it'll actually have a toughening effect because it'll eventually just sort of coagulate and sometimes even cook the proteins on the outside layer. So you gotta, you have to kind of watch it. And the way you do it with meat is you just push it with your thumb, It's sheer force, right? So if it's easy for you to push into it, then it's still tender.
Okay, and then the other way that it matters is the acids will inhibit enzymes. And you can have in rye, which has incredible enzymatic activity, you can have it very quickly happen that the enzymes denature the starches. And in rye bread baking, you're counting on the starches to take the place of gluten. There's not nearly as much gluten in bread. So, and indeed, in Europe and in the United States, you bake rye at different temperatures because there's different starches. And you need to get the starches caught at the perfect moment. Like when they developed enough that when they get hot, they'll keep a similar sheath, like, the gluten. Gluten basically is this mass of proteins that becomes elastic and forms into a kind of tangled sheath. All these proteins are lined up into kind of a sheath that captures the gases, and the gases are produced by the fermentation, right? And so you have all these little innate bubbles when you make bread, right? And they have gluten or starch that are on the walls, and when the gases get hot and expand, that's what gives you the crumb in your bread. And if you don't have something to reduce that enzymatic activity in your rye, you get what's called a starch attack. Your starches all get denatured, and your rye is flat.
That's the name of your punk band, Starch Attack.
Starch attack. Well, there really should be one out there by now, right? They perform exclusively at bakery conferences, right?
There you go. Yeah. Well, I was reading today about baking soda, actually, at chemical leaveners and how they work because they are about an acid-alkaline balance. So it's about, which is really fascinating. Like I've always just sort of wondered about that, but never taken the time to look it up. But I was particularly interested in like we in the real food scene, like we've started using aluminum-free baking powders, right? Because we don't want to be putting aluminum into our bodies. But aluminum-free baking powders are mostly like fast-acting. Right? And so a lot of the like slow release of gases that you want in doughs that you want to hold up, you won't get from an aluminum-free baking powder. And so I was wondering, I was going to ask you, is that where like you really want fermented doughs so that you get that long, slow release of gas like from the fermentative microbes without an aluminum-based leavener?
That would definitely help a whole lot. The problem is if you're making pancakes or something.
But that's when it doesn't matter. Like you can have an
fast
initial
one, you're
release of
fine.
gas
Right, yeah,
and you're
sure.
fine.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, if you're doing a quick bread, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But if you want to use, like maybe what might be a problem would be something like Irish soda bread, where it's steamed on the stove, So that might be an issue. And maybe you could make a sourdough starter work in there. I've had a lot of fun playing with how to make sourdough pancakes that are just sourdough. Because usually sourdough pancakes, the whole idea is you take this leftover starter and you use it to flavor your pancakes, but you raise them with baking powder and baking soda because you're mixing them. And if you mix them, you've beaten down all that airiness that you got from the stuff. And so the way you would do that is you would make a wetter pancake batter and you would let it rise and you would just pour it on without stirring it. So there'd still be a lot of bubbles and it would be probably a hotter pan. So you'd have to be ready to flip it really fast after the bottom cooks and maybe ideally move it to a cooler pan to do the other side and let it cook through, But I've made it work, but it's not, it's not 100%. You're still playing. The fascinating thing, and I haven't had time to research it, I didn't have a sourdough starter going when I saw it, but I was in Chicago not long ago at all, and we happened to be in one of the big supermarkets there, and they have massive ethnic food areas, right? And we're walking along just because we like doing that, looking at all this stuff, we have no idea what it is, right? And there's this product called Zur, Z-U-R.
Oh, is that the Polish?
It's basically sourdough starter soup.
Drink.
You drink it or you make a soup from it. Yeah,
I've heard of it.
yeah. And so it can be wheat. That's got a different name for it. But basically they ferment and add flavor and also release a lot of nutrients, right, through fermentation. But actually what they're doing there with the fermentation is attacking acids.
Yeah.
Because acids bind nutrients. That's another piece that I don't know how much we're going to go into it, but basically phytic acid makes minerals not available to us. And so McGee.
But not all acids, right?
No, specific ones. Phytic acid is one of them,
Oxalic does.
Yes, right, exactly. And so McGee, the science of food or whatever, he uses that as an excuse to not eat whole wheat. Since that happens, why bother with whole wheat pasta? Right. There's other reasons to eat whole wheat besides the available minerals, but if you ferment it, that stuff overnight, it would release it because the fermentation does that. There's a world where you use the acid impact on something is it conceivable that you'd eat a soup made out of rye? And yet it's a major food in Poland and the Ukraine and places
There's actually
like
an
that.
awesome story about that in the one and only issue of Cured magazine, if anyone's interested, and it's about using zure as the base for all these other foods, and they smuggled them all into this restaurant, and they made a meal like right under the noses of all these people who were trying to limit ingredients, and they basically the whole meal was like subversive and revolutionary. It's really cool. I can't explain it very well. You got to read the article in order to understand it. But anyways, the point of that whole discussion is that the acid and alkaline balance in chemical leaveners is what releases gases, which is what creates bubbles, which is what allows the food to rise. And so if you think you can skip the baking powder, chances are you probably shouldn't, unless you have some kind of fermentation going on, like an Indian dosa or something like that, right? Which don't really rise very much anyway, but they do have bubbles. Okay, so how do you know if your food has a proper acid balance? It will taste bright, sharp, clean, and complete. That's the best way I can describe it to you. So if it's lacking something, if it tastes too deep, if it tastes dull, you might need a little kick of acid. So we're going to go into the part where we talk about how to do it. Okay, so how to use acids in cooking. First of all, understand the relative acidity already present in the food, okay? So if you're making something with, so this is something we talked about earlier, like balsamic vinegar versus rice vinegar versus apple cider vinegar versus sherry vinegar. They all have a different relative acidity to one another, or they're all acid ingredients. But balsamic vinegar has a higher proportion of sugars to the alcohols in it than any other type of vinegar. So it's not going to be as acidic on your palate as, say, distilled white vinegar or apple cider vinegar. Rice vinegar is a little more alkaline than some of the more American wine vinegars, and well, those are more European, but then the American distilled vinegar for sure. So work with that, practice around with that. The other thing is understand how your method of cooking is going to bring out or create acids in food. The processes of caramelization and browning actually produce acidic compounds. So that's why molasses, brown sugar, and caramel are acidic ingredients, because they've undergone caramelization. It's sugar that's been caramelized, right? And so perfect example, you're braising something. Who here braises? Bless you, that's good. You should be. So what you do when you braise is you're actually cooking something in liquid covered up at low temperatures. That does not produce browning reactions, right? And so if you want, the reason we sear things before we put them in the braise is to create the browning reaction. It not only makes it beautiful to look at when it comes out of the pot, but it's also introducing acid components that make it taste better. Does that make sense? All right. And very often we are braising the food in an acid ingredient like wine or beer or cider, but that extra Maillard reaction that we're giving it by searing it is actually what we call layering of acids, which compounds and complexifies flavor, right? So we're going to talk about all the ways that we do that in a second. So getting browning reactions when it's necessary, when it makes sense, right? When you're making a soup, you don't need you need to brown all the beans beforehand, right? Like those foods don't have brown on them. But anytime you're doing caramelization or browning, you're getting acid components. It's a good thing. So then practice anchoring your recipes with acids like tomatoes, vinegars, wines, beers, and buttermilk for deeper balance and flavor. So this comes into play when we're braising, steaming, or making reductions, are a great way to anchor something with the acid component. So that would be like, oh, I'm making a risotto, right? Or I'm making a pasta dish. It's very common to put your aromatics or your shallots or your garlic or your onions in the pan, get them glassy, and then what are you doing? Pouring a wine over, pouring on a vinegar, and then letting it reduce or cook down. So that's a way to anchor that dish with a nice acid component. And then you're going to throw in your rice, you're going to throw in your broth, and then later you might do a twist of lemon at the end. So that's another example of layering. That's the difference between anchoring and accenting, right? So then always plan to accent the dishes that you create, whether you've anchored them or not with an acid component. Accent them afterward with stuff like this, or pickles, cheese, condiments like mustard and ketchup, salsas, chutneys, cultured dairy like yogurt. So you can think, oh, all the foods around the world, like a Greek, why am I blanking on the sandwich in the Greece? Hero, thank you. They put the tzatziki on it, right? So that's that acid yogurt-based sauce, right? A lot of Indian cuisine will also include like a raita or something, right? So to add the acid component, that's what it's there for. Pickles are ubiquitous all over the world as a thing that we plop down on the table or put on the side in order to give ourselves a little acid kick. And so I want to give you the next sample at this point. So what you have in front of you, and you have to keep it in this, like you have to keep it facing in the direction it's facing, otherwise you'll mix it up, okay? So this is winter squash, or it's a type of pumpkin that we grew here on the farm. The top, on each board, the top row, it's steamed in water, okay? The second row, it's steamed in rice vinegar. The third row, it's steamed in rice vinegar and it has a squeeze of lime on it. The very bottom thing is a sage herb salsa made with white wine vinegar. And if you want to add it to your bites, you can. But I want you to, obviously there's a difference in the acid that's on there, but what I want you to do is pay attention to the flavor of the pumpkin and see how it changes as you progress through the bites. So really start with the water, the top one, and work your way down. So I might just do like a board per row of people, and if you could just pluck. This is the water? Yeah, the water's at the very top, and the green on the bottom is the salsa. So that's what I was talking about, using acid to anchor a dish. Like if you're gonna make a steamed squash, why steam it with water? You know, when you could steam it with beer or wine or vinegar or something, you know, it's really adding an extra bit of flavor.
The color's a lot different too.
And the color is different, and the reason for that is because acids bond to molecules so that it prevents oxidation, right? So oxidation is that exchange of ions when the surface of meat or fruit or food. So that's why they say swipe a lemon over a wedge of apple if you don't want it to brown, because those hydrogens are going onto those molecules rather than oxygen, so you're getting color instead of brown, right?
And you can be bitterly disappointed if somebody tells you just because the logic of that makes them think that it's true, that you can keep purple beans purple by putting lemon juice in the cooker. I got told that, I was all excited. Not true.
Yeah, well, they're not turning green because of oxidation, right?
They're turning green because their dye is coming out, or their
Well, I guess it just is not, and they're not green, they're not purple all the way through, right? It's just a layer on the outside that gets cooked, so it, I guess so, yeah.
Lemon does not fix it, that's for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so how's it going? What do you think? You taste the difference?
it gets better.
Do you think the pumpkin tastes better as you add acids? Does it get to be too much? Does the acid overwhelm it at the end?
I actually like it best in the water.
Do you?
Right. Well, we all have different taste buds
Yeah, we
and
do.
different
It's very
sensitivities.
subjective.
Yeah.
I think also as you work with this, your palate's going to change, right? And so you may develop more, more you work with acid, you may develop more recognition of sweetness and more recognition of bitterness in your food, right? And so it's all a big interplay and a big experiment.
The stage is awesome.
Oh, I'm glad you like it. The recipe is in the recipe for that is in your handout, and the only thing, it's like basically like making a pesto, but you do it with any herb. You can do it with any herb. You can do it with mixes of herbs. It's one of my favorite things to do, especially for like soups or appetizers. But the only thing I do is like I chop up the garlic first, and then I let it macerate or sit in the vinegar or wine or whatever I'm using or lemon juice for at least 10 to 15 minutes. And then I'll actually scoop with a fork the minced garlic or the sliced garlic out of the vinegar and add it too, and then I blend up the pesto, and then I taste it. And if I feel like it needs more vinegar, I just take the vinegar that the garlic was soaking in and just drizzle it in and keep mixing it until it's got the acidity that I want. And different herbs will call for kicked up acidity or kicked down acidity, right? So you get to decide.
I like the second one best.
Nice. Yeah, I do too, I think. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is producing your own acidic ingredients via fermentation and by making your own vinegar. And so we're not going to go exhaustively into fermentation, lacto-fermentation or lactic acid fermentation, because there's an entire YouTube video of me babbling about it here in this room several years ago, and it covers making vegetable ferments, lacto-fermented condiments, and also a little bit of vinegar, but I didn't take you as far in that video as I will today with the vinegar. So you have 2 recipes in your handout. They both involve persimmons. One is a fermented persimmon with lemon, which I'm turning into a syrup, which I will be stuffing into a roast for Christmas. But there's a lot of other ideas that you can do into a porchetta, so it's a pork roast. And so this is just persimmons that are a little bit maybe ripe to a little bit overripe. Took the stems off of them. Anytime you want to produce lacto-fermentation, all you need is 2% salt to the weight of the food that you're fermenting, okay? So I gave you an example in your handout. If you had a pound of persimmons, and I'd do the mathematical equation for you to figure out what 2% of salt is of that. But this is basically a salt to sugar in 2-to-1 ratio that I used for this. So I took the persimmons, I measured out how many I had, then I figured out what 2% salt I needed, and then I took half that amount, and that was how much sugar I incorporated, mixed the salt and sugar together, and then gently just rubbed, because I wanted the persimmons to be relatively whole. So gently rubbed the persimmons and then packed that salt and sugar into where I took the stems off, put a couple wedges of lemon in there, stuck it in this weck jar, which has airlocks on it, right? And then I let it sit there. I actually think I put a towel over it first. I didn't airlock it right away. Had a towel over it, and as the salt caused these persimmons to lose their liquid, it created a brine for itself. So what you need for lacto-fermentation is you need an anaerobic environment. So those persimmons have to be underneath that brine. And then the lactic acid bacteria comes in, and what it does is it eats sugars and produces lactic acids and alcohols, which drops the pH, makes it an acidic ingredient, and also produces the sourly flavors that we associate with fermented foods. It's that easy. And it takes, this probably took about a month. I'm getting better at not walking away from my ferments and just being like, oh, well, it's definitely fermented, and sometimes it's a little too fermented. So I'm trying to catch it right at that stage where the acidity doesn't overwhelm it, and you can still taste the persimmon, or you can still taste, I can smell the persimmonness of this, and if anybody wants to come and take a sniff of it, and you'll smell the sweetness. Even though it's acidic, and even though it's fermented, you'll smell the sweetness there. So
after you refrigerate it, it'll still keep working.
It will keep working slowly after, and so I'm a little bit puzzled as to what to do with this, because I really like where it is now, but I don't need it until the holidays, so I'm like, should I decant it and freeze? So it's a fun adventure. What I'll probably do is take the persimmons out of their brine, save the brine for some other fun adventure. Who knows what? Maybe I'll make a sauce or pickle something with it. Who knows? But the persimmons and the lemons themselves will be cooked down and reduced into a syrup or like a sauce that I can stuff inside of this roast. That's the idea. But you could do a million things with them, and I listed a whole litany of them on your recipe just to spark your imagination. All right? The other thing I did with these persimmons, and I don't have the vinegar with me because I forgot it, is to make vinegar. And so in the other video that we did, that I just gave people a Scoby to make vinegar with. So Scoby stands for Symbiotic Community of Bacteria and Yeast. It's not a mushroom. Yeasts are fungi, so that's a little bit of fungus. But a lot of people are like, oh, the kombucha mushroom. It's not a mushroom, all right? It's a symbiotic community of bacteria and yeast. And so what happens when you make vinegar, and you'll be able to smell these. These smell like ethanol. Yes. So what? They smell like alcohol, right? You smell it? The difference is that those were put in, the persimmons themselves, a couple of pinches of sugar, were vacuum sealed in a big vacuum bag. All the oxygen was deprived of them, and they were not in a liquid at all. And then they just started to off-gas. Off-gas, 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 and that bag blew up until it was like about to pop. And then that's when I knew it's like releasing carbon dioxide, right? And it's producing ethanol. And then I took and I slit the corner of the bag, released all the carbon dioxide, decanted the liquid that had come off of it. And then I put it in a jar, covered it in a washcloth, and then these alcohol-eating bacteria and yeast that make up the Scoby, that need oxygen then develop that film over top of it. So I'm making my own Scoby, basically. But you have to have the ethanol stage first, right? And then you move into the oxygen-loving Scoby phase, okay? So you can do that with any fruit. You know, you could take a bunch of blueberries, vacuum seal them, see what happens. I bet you could make some blueberry vinegar if you wanted to. You can do it with apples. If you want to make your own apple cider vinegar, get some apples, get a little bit of sugar, tiny little bit of water, put them in a jar, and let them funkify. Let them alcoholize, let them become like, it'll smell like apple alcohol. And then you can, you know, decant the liquid, put the washcloth over it, let it get air, and it will take some time, but you'll get a little jellyfish film looking thing over the top of it. That's the Scoby. Those Acetobacter and those yeasts are going to consume that alcohol and turn it into acetic acid, and acetic acid is vinegar, right? So lots of fun projects in your future. I can see them now. And you have those recipes. I know it's a lot, but you have those recipes in your handout, so you can go home and apply them to whatever fruit you might have or want to make things out of.
And that Scoby can then be transferred to the same ingredients, and it'll go much more quickly because you've now got the right life there. You know.
Very good point. So then I could go and juice a bunch of apples and then put my Scoby in that, and it would go much faster, right?
Or you could give that as a gift to somebody, teach them that, and they would have that gift for as long as they maintain that Scoby.
So this liquid, this is the liquid I'm talking about, that I would decant off and then let it breathe, and then the Scoby should develop on here. And then these, I don't know, I'll probably put them in some cooked food, something, and let the alcohol kind of cook off, and then just have whatever, persimmon fortified spaghetti sauce or something. I don't know. Haven't decided yet. But I just really don't want to waste them. Okay, so we did fermentation. We talked a little bit about layering acids, but Pat's going to make you a little pasta dish to round things off.
The gluten-free version of my tarragon lemon sauce that I wanted to make for you, I thickened with oat flour, and that was a mistake. Because oat flour, I now know, I've used it for other ways, and I've used it even to thicken, but not where I wanted to have a delicate flavor. Totally sucked up all the tarragon. It's gone, the tarragon. And I didn't have as much tarragon as I thought. I used it for the last class that I cooked for. And if I had abundant tarragon, I could have piled it in there and hammered it in there and eventually got it to taste. So if there were somebody here who couldn't have, well, actually, if you're gluten intolerant, then you won't get to taste the sauce. The sauce has flour in it for that. But we're going to start with sorrel sauce. So sorrel is an easy to grow or harvest weed. And I looked at online, I always try to check out what people are saying out there. And I think they're misleading you a little, like that one of the sorrel sauces had pictures of oxalis. And to me, that's not sorrel. They say it tastes the same. Not really. It's a sharper taste in the oxalis. You could use it that way, but it's sharper because there's even more oxalic acid. You know,
Oxalis is like that shamrocky looking plant, if you don't know.
Known as sour grass as kids, everybody used to eat it. You know, it looks like a shamrock, but it tastes sour. And that will work. You can make a sauce that way, but boy, you have to be careful because it's going to be really sharp. This is either French sorrel that looks kind of like chard, but is perennial. People know that one. I recommend it for any garden.
Oh my gosh, it's so wonderful.
Yeah, because
What I always thought of with sorrel was what you just described.
Right,
That's what I was.
So sheep sorrel or...
sheep sorrel is a weed that is closely related, and in my mind for salad, much preferred because it's so lovely, because it's got this kind of arrowhead look with these little points that come off the side. And you can find places where it's very heavily taken over. It just dominates, and indeed sometimes it's a problem, you know. But if you eat the heck out of it, it won't be a problem. And so you can just come and mow it and put it in your salads or add it wherever you want to touch a taste of green. And indeed, I only could harvest so much sorrel from our young plants they were planted this year, and so I added some sheep sorrel to these sauces to add more sour. And so they have both of them in there. They're so closely related it wouldn't matter at all in flavor and in function.
There's also red vein sorrel, which is lovely.
And that's
Blood
one,
sorrel.
and that's right, yeah, okay, indeed, yes, right. Anyway, sorrel sauce is a classic for fish or chicken, and I just saw people talking about using it with eggs. Anything that's not very deeply, robustly flavored, it just kind of heightens the flavor and adds a nice piquantness to it also. And so we're just going to have it on pasta because that's the easiest thing to do. So this is simply shallots cooked in butter, and then add the sorrel until it looks army green. Everybody know that delightful color? Yeah. That just tells you it's cooked enough. Okay? And then adding cream, salt, and pepper. That is how simple it is.
Wow. So you win. There's enough for everybody to have.
Now, some recipes say to add lemon. I'd rather not. I think it's a different flavor. I did have to add lemon to the vegan version, which we might as well taste. The reason was I couldn't find alternative milk that I could stand as far as the one that had a flavor I would like. That it turned out it had vanilla in it. So the vanilla was kind of getting in the way. So I added a little bit of lemon, and that kind of got rid of the vanilla.
Y'all tell me when with the sauce. You want more? Yeah, that's fine. There's plenty. Lovely, huh?
It is so easy to grow sorrel. Nobody should ever have a piece of land that doesn't have some sorrel plants on them. They grow themselves. They're up and harvestable for probably 10 months in the year. They like sun just fine, but they can handle a little bit of shade. Now, what I'd say about it, you may love it. You don't want to overdo it because it is high in oxalic acid.
Thank you, Pat.
The recipe for the sorrel?
Yes, the sorrel sauce. There's a vegan version and a regular version in your handout. And then there's a little note about what Pat does, which is which is like a hybrid of the vegan version and the non-vegan version.
I gave you amounts, but frankly, that's not how I cook. If I didn't think it was tart enough, I'd just add more sorrel. You know, I would just keep adding it till I had the flavor I liked. You know, it's totally a perennial. Yeah, it's a perennial that you just can't stop.
You can get a variety called Belleville, which is like the oldest one, and I planted it in my garden. It's like bloop, 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 direct seeded before the frosts had stopped in the spring, and they are now like, it's like a bush of sorrel plants, and I just keep harvesting them, and right now I could, like before class, Pat was like, I don't have enough sorrel. I was like, I could get you some out of the garden. It's just like pumping.
Yeah, and actually I should have had to get it because when I came back, I realized that the vanilla was muddying the vegan one.
Should I plant from seed?
You can, yeah, it's easy to start from seed. It's also very easy to get divisions. You know, it divides really easy. It's like one of those, you can't mess up with it kind of, it's like chives, you know, except for it doesn't get those nasty black aphids. So it's even better than chives. Yeah, yeah, it's really pretty perfect.
Is vanilla offset by lemon? Is that a thing?
Well, it kind of hid it in this way, yeah. You know, yeah, if it's enough flavors can muddy the waters and you can hide the vanilla. There wasn't a lot of vanilla in it, you know, but it was a combination of almond and coconut. Most milks, vegan milks from here are just too thin. And so I wanted that coconut in there too, but straight coconut tastes too much like coconut for me, you know. And so I kind of just didn't even see that it said vanilla. I didn't want to see it, you know.
Oh, it's vanilla.
Yeah, right, you know.
I was like, what are we talking about vanilla for?
Because they had vanilla in it, you know. It was like, oh crap, you know. Right. Yeah. Anyway, what I might do is give you a little taste, a little dab of the vegan one. You can see this. What's different about this is it was made with flour rather than cream. Cream is so thick that you don't need to add the flour.
What am I supposed to do?
Just put a little dab on, then when they come around with their sauce with the pasta, they can go ahead and add a little bit of that pasta and get a taste of the vegan one. And why that's really important for this class is not about the vegan, but because I added lemon to that one also to kind of hide that vanilla. So you get to see the interface. And they recommend that. A lot of the sorrel sauces say to use lemon. I actually think that it's not as good. You know?
Flour in this one, right?
There is flour. You don't want to taste this one. Yeah.
It jumps right out.
The vanilla jumps right out still?
Vanilla jumps right out. Maybe it smells like, oh yeah.
Well, then not enough lemon. Yeah.
I think it's good.
Vanilla actually can be used in savory cooking. It's just not what I want it for sure, you know? Yeah. Okay, so any questions about the sorrel sauce? Can you imagine that on fish? You know, it's actually great on just pasta too, of course. Chicken, wonderful, you know. If you wanted to do a version of eggs Florentine and wanted to be a little bit exotic, you could do that instead of just a straight white sauce, you know. Okay, so then the next one. I'll describe what it is. Well, I thought I brought every pot in, but
I mean, I think we mostly hit all the points from the handout that we planned on. So I just, at this point, want to open it up for questions, and then hopefully Pat will find his tarragon sauce. Yeah.
Is adding zest to something like enough acid to make a difference, or is that?
Totally, just depending on what you're doing. Yeah. But zest is very, very bright, right? So it sometimes goes a longer way than just a squeeze of citrus. And sometimes both
It
is.
has both sour and bitter in it.
Yes, it does. As long as you, if you avoid getting any of the pith, then you'll have less bitter. But who's perfect at zesting?
Sometimes when I do a recipe that just calls for the zest, I'll squeeze the lemon and freeze it in a little tablespoon, what is it, like a ice cube tray. Is that as powerful after it's been frozen as it would be if it were fresh?
The juice? I would think so. Yeah. Shouldn't change it. Shouldn't change the acidity. Other questions?
Earlier you were talking about adding acid to something you're cooking and something about the effect it has. But with making bone broth, for example, you add some vinegar to it at the beginning and let it cook for hours. So what actually happens, what's the role of the acid in that kind of process?
Well, a lot of people add acid to their bone broth because they're looking to draw more minerals out of the bones. And the acid has a bonding effect in that case, just like when we talked about with the pectin or the egg whites. But in this case of the beans, I was talking about adding the acid early on because of the cellulose in the beans and the phytic acid that's already in them, that it will actually produce, if you add it too early, it will just produce the effect where the bean takes forever and ever and ever to soften at all. So if you're gonna add acid to, so this is a perfect example. If you want to make a bean soup and it's a long cooking stew, for example, I would go ahead and cook the beans in salted water or something with garlic and herbs, but omit the acid. Just cook them until they're soft, but they're not collapsed, right? And then transfer them into some kind of acid medium, like that has tomatoes in it or wine in it or something, and then do the long stewing, say with the leg of lamb or the whatever else you're trying to stew with them. And that acid component at that point in the cooking process is going to help them hold up, right? Whereas if you had added it at the beginning, it would just take forever and ever and ever to get your beans where you wanted them. Does that help? It's not having the effect in the bone broth like that because there's no hemicellulose or cellulose in your bone broth, right? The thing it will do with meats is affecting the collagen protein, so it will cause them to denature, which is actually something that you kind of want them to do when you want to make a gelatin-rich stock, right? You want the collagen to denature into its component gelatin molecules, right? And actually it will do that anyway with heat and cold, but acid, I'm sure, is playing some kind of a role there. I don't actually add acid to my bone broth, and I don't know what quantities people are adding it in, so I don't know how much effect it's having on proteins, right, in that case. Does that help?
Yeah.
Put raw vinegar, apple cider vinegar?
I don't.
Okay, because it's most of the recipes are saying to add that to pull out the...
Yes, and I have heard that. How much do you add? Just like a couple tablespoons?
Well, they usually have a recipe, but yeah, it's only like that.
Yeah, minute amount, yeah. Which makes sense for bonding purposes, but not necessarily for like major chemical reactions of any kind. Yeah, I just boil the crap out of it. But maybe I'll start adding vinegar. Other questions, comments, obscene observations? Yes?
Is vinegarized kombucha similar to the apple cider vinegar as far as health benefits or use in?
Yeah, or if we're using as an acid component in the cooking. So yeah, and I guess what you're speaking about is kombucha that's just fermented for a really long time, yeah. And so it's more acidic than it is sweet. And in that case, sure, if you can't drink it, you might as well cook with it, right? Salad dressing, that's a great idea. I like to put it in sausage. Super good. Here's the tarragon sauce.
okay, but a word about salad dressings and acid. You want the acid in the vinegar to work both for the brightness, but it's also got to do with the emulsifying. So you want to make sure that you add, the oil to the acid in a slow way and keep that emulsification going. Yeah, just like a slow stream. That's if you do it in a blender, you have the lid on, but you take the little top off, and you have that stuff spinning, and you just dribble it in.
Yeah, like a mayonnaise.
Like making mayonnaise, exactly.
And you can totally play, you can have the same dressing with every ingredient exactly the same except for lemon juice or vinegar or balsamic vinegar
changes the dressing.
or champagne vinegar. All those are going to give you completely different
It's the same
dressings.
with the oil too. The
Yeah,
fact
that's
that
true.
you do walnut oil versus olive oil.
That is true, yeah. I tend to think of that less than I do of the vinegar part because I just have the olive oil on the counter and I use it,
Yeah.
That's the, So I'm just waiting for this to get hot because it was, or warm, it was in my car, so it was quite cold.
So do you want me to give people more pasta?
Yes, put the pasta out and I'll come around with this in a moment.
Does it have flour?
This does, unfortunately, yeah. This was the one where I was doing that one with the oat, and you can taste this. It tastes very lemony and quite thick, but it just. And if I'd had a full jar of tarragon, I could have overwhelmed the oat, but I didn't. And indeed, I wish now, since that didn't work, that I put all that tarragon in this one. Tarragon. Okay, and so the point of this sauce is that we have a world of herbs that have a licorice flavor, and what defines them is the intensity of that licorice flavor, right? And all of those really shine when combined with an acid. And so this is a classic. There's a name for it. I'm not going to pronounce it at all. The last time I saw that name in print was 30 years ago, but it's something like Rivigetti or something like that. But it's a classic sauce that's basically tarragon and lemon juice are the two major flavors.
Do you know of a plant that grows around here that has a strong licorice flavor?
That's a wild plant? Well, there's lots of them. Tarragon is one. Fennel is another one. Mexican tarragon is another one. Chervil is another one. Yeah, you can grow loads of them that have that flavor, and indeed you can grow licorice. It's very medicinal. You want to be careful about how much of that you eat, But it's powerful medicinal, and it can be used as a flavoring too, but probably with a lot of caution because it's quite medicinal. Okay, so I think this is warm enough now. Okay, so this is a white sauce, classic white sauce, right? Basically, a little bit of shallot, not very much at all, because I want you to taste the tarragon and the lemon. And then when that has gotten hot and the shallot has cooked a little bit, is becoming transparent, then stir in flour, okay, and stir it in till you have a roux. Cook that long enough that it doesn't have a raw flour taste, which doesn't take very long. And then dribble in your liquid. It doesn't have to be milk or cream. This happens to be cream because I had the cream there. But it can be milk. It can be another ingredient. It could be water even. It could be stock. It's still going to have this bright flavor. Okay? And you just basically dribble that in until you have a nice thick sauce, okay? Keep stirring, turn the heat down. If you turn it on too fast and pour too fast, you'll lose the emulsion. If you have it on way too fast, you'll burn it. But you just stir. You'll learn to make it. Learning a white sauce is a great tool because you can put so many different flavors in it. Once you have
sauce video too, if you're like sauce.
Yeah, if you're sauce challenged, we've got a video talking about it. Then you take tarragon, and I find with tarragon that it's this kind of big leaf the way you get it, and it can take quite a while for that flavor to release. And if you're serving it quickly like I was today, I take it and run it through a food mill or a mortar and pestle. And if you don't have time for that, at least have clean hands and rub it vigorously between your hands into the thing. So you've broken it up some and released more of those essential oils. They'll eventually come out, but it may not happen for the dinner. It may be the next day. You'll go, now it tastes like what I wanted it to taste like. I would have put more tarragon in that. I would split it between the sauce that ate it and this sauce. I would like more tarragon to the lemon. But I think you're getting the tarragon flavor. And the combination of that, then you add lemon to taste. Basically, it's the same recipe as the vegan sauce, except for you use the liquid of your choice. It could be milk or cream, right? And then you add tarragon and lemon to taste, and do it by taste. And that's it.
Okay, so that's the part that says Pat does this by, and I thought it was referring to the sorrel sauce, but just note that that is actually the tarragon sauce.
Right, which also the basic recipe was there for the vegan sorrel sauce. We just transferred instead to it milk, pulled out the coconut milk, and then put the ingredients we wanted. It's just a basic white sauce recipe, you know? A roux and liquid, stirred in at the right speed. You know, it's a white sauce if you use something like milk or cream. If you're using stock, it's probably not a white sauce. It's just a sauce. Yeah, it's a brown sauce, yeah, right. But you can endlessly play with this. I learned a lot of it because I went to work for a jazz bar in New Orleans as a youngin', and the owner who wanted to save money said, save rice and vegetables and put a different sauce on every night. So I learned all my sauces. Yes?
Question, if you don't want to use flour to make a roux, what it?
Okay, I've used buckwheat flour. I didn't want to use that because it's starker, you know?
Chickpea flour works well.
And I had chickpea flour in the freezer. I was going to go for that. I found this and thought, oh, this should work fine. But
That's what I do all vegan roux with.
it's chickpea flour. Yeah. I've used almond flour. It's a little bit grainy when you use it, though, you know? And oat flour have lots of seasoning. I mean, it thickened up really nicely and quickly, but it is a flavor sink, you know? An incredible flavor sink. The tarragon just went away. Anyway, that combination, you know, anytime you're using tarragon, it doesn't have to be in a sauce. It shines with an acid. And it, you know, the classic is lemon. It could also be orange, though. It works really nice with orange. It just doesn't matter. Something that just adds that brightness to kind of bounce off of that sweetness from the licorice flavor.
All right, other questions or comments?
Wow, lots of bacon.
I'm glad. That's the idea. Please eat this squash if anyone feels the spirit. And that will be all we have for you. Thanks so much for coming. Happy cooking.